Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about the latest in gun control litigation and early voting. I'll then join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here's some of the top stories from the past week. Early voting sites opened Thursday in nearly every county, with the exception of Cook County and the city of Chicago, where things will get going in early October. Katrina Peterson has more.
Illinois State Board of Elections spokesman Matt Dietrich said at the start of the early voting season, voters will likely have to vote at their county clerk's office.
A couple of weeks into the process, or a few weeks ahead of Election Day, you'll see pretty substantial expansion of early voting locations in some of our larger counties.
The increase in early voting locations typically correlates with the number of early votes cast. Dietrich explained that the closer Election Day is, the more early votes are cast, so more locations will open.
People aren't necessarily rushing out on, in this case, on September 26th to cast their vote. Some are, but generally we see most of the early voting being done in that last couple of weeks prior to Election Day.
I'm Katrina Peterson.
The Illinois Supreme Court has denied Cook County's request for an appeal on a case challenging the gun and ammo tax there. In 2012, Cook County approved a $25 per gun and 1 to 5 cent per cartridge of ammunition tax. Initial challenges went to the Illinois Supreme Court, which in 2021 ruled against the county. The county then modified the ordinance. Gun rights advocate Todd Vandermeide sued again on a Second Amendment challenge after the district court dismissed the case earlier this year and appeals court reinstated it. Wednesday, the Illinois Supreme Court denied the county's request to appeal the case there. Vandermeide said recent U.S. Supreme Court precedent said that a gun law must have historical analogs.
And once it's protected conduct, it's up to the state to show an analogy against, that, hey, laws like this existed either in 1791 or maybe around 1868.
Vandermeide said if the state can't show laws from the time of the U.S. Constitution's ratification, they have, quote, a hard row to hoe. In a separate case, an appellate court has denied another attempt for the state to delay a gun challenge for Illinois' firearm owner's ID card. Gun Save Life sued the state, alleging the FOID card's unconstitutional. A Sangamon County judge sided with the state. Gun Save Life appealed in November 2023. Since then, the state motioned for 3 extensions, which were granted. In September, the state motioned to pause the case in order to await the outcome of a different FOID card challenge in front of the Illinois Supreme Court. The judge said the state has had enough delays and the case they're wanting to wait for is not similar to the Gun Save Life challenge of the FOID card. Oral arguments are set in that case for November 14th. Gun Save Life Executive Director John Bach said they'll take the case all the way.
And ultimately, we're going to prevail. The question is whether or not the Illinois Supreme Court will do the right thing or if we have to go to the U.S. Supreme Court to make this happen.
Those are the top stories from the week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss those stories and more. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. We are recording this on Thursday, September 26th. There have been several developments in recent days in legal cases challenging Illinois' myriad restrictions on gun rights in the state. Joining me to discuss these elements is Greg Bishop, Illinois Associate Editor, Greg, you covered all of these developments. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think we should start with the challenge to the gun ban. Of course, that dominated headlines last week with a 4-day bench trial and the closing remarks from federal judge Stephen McGlynn reflecting on the 1917 race riot in East St. Louis. Commenting, saying that if the black victims in that community had the firearms that they were debating all week last week, would there have been a different outcome than there was with practically entire swaths of the city being burned down back in 1917? But some of the other things that have come out of that case are seemingly going to impact other federal challenges as well. In particular, there's a challenge against silencers and the ban on these silencers. In a comment that Judge Stephen McGlynn made throughout the trial, he talked about how these silencers may be important for home defense. If there are other people in the home, they need to be able to hear commands from somebody who's addressing invaders. So a silencer would help limit the sound of the firearm. So analysts have taken that comment and said, well, that could play out for other cases challenging Illinois gun control laws. But obviously, 30 days from last Thursday, when they wrapped up the 4-day bench trial, they have 30 days to file briefs. Those briefs are going to focus on history and tradition of the Second Amendment, whereas the trial with the witness testimony really focused on the difference between military firearms and civilian firearms. So it'll be interesting to see what happens after that 30 days. Here now we've got about 3 weeks for them to turn those briefs in, and then the judge could make a ruling on that. So obviously that's top of mind for a lot of people. The big question is, will he issue a permanent injunction, or will he issue a permanent injunction with a stay to allow for the appeal? Either way, it's likely the appeals court will take this up quickly, and we'll see just how fast they act on that case. So a lot of people waiting to see the outcome there. That's not the only challenge that's facing Illinois gun laws. We've had a series of different things happen just this week in different levels of court. It will start also with a FOID card challenge that was heard back in May. Last week, the Illinois Supreme Court ultimately ruled on this case, and it was a case challenging 2 individuals who had their FOID cards suspended when they were arrested for reckless discharge of a firearm. Those 2 individuals, when their FOID card was suspended, were prevented from purchasing firearms or even owning firearms. But they ended up pleading guilty to a lower charge misdemeanor, which doesn't rise to the level of a FOID card suspension, so they got their FOID cards back. Ultimately, the Supreme Court didn't rule on the merits of the challenge of the FOID card law, the Firearm Owner's ID card law. Instead, they vacated the ruling. They vacated the case and just said there's no case here because they got their FOID cards back. Obviously, that didn't address the question of the constitutionality of the Firearm Owner's ID card. But Dan, that's not the only case challenging the FOID card in Illinois. Another separate case filed by Guns Save Life, a gun advocacy group here in Illinois. They had a case that they filed last year in the state court, and a Sangamon County judge sided with the state and said that the FOID card is constitutional. Then Gun Save Life appealed to the appellate court. And this week, the appellate court denied the state's motion to put a pause on the case. So the state had already, since last year, when it was appealed to the appellate court, they had requested 3 delays to file briefs. All 3 of those delays were granted. But then they came back earlier this year and requested a stay, which a stay is essentially a legal term to halt a proceeding or to halt a motion. So they requested a stay, saying that they were waiting for a separate FOID card challenge. This is now FOID card challenge number 3 in front of the Illinois Supreme Court. And they said that they wanted finality in that case before they dealt with the Gun Save Life case. But the judge in the appellate court essentially said the case that's in front of the Illinois Supreme Court, separate from the one we talked about where they vacated, but this other case, this third case, they're not the same issues that they're dealing with in the Gun Save Life case. The Gun Save Life case against the FOID cards challenging the overall constitutionality of the FOID card. The separate case, I believe it's Thompson, in front of the Illinois Supreme Court, deals with somebody who was arrested for having a firearm in their vehicle, and they didn't have the proper FOID card, something to that effect. But they ultimately said that the outcome of that case will have no bearing on the Gun Save Life case. So the appellate court denied the state's motion to stay Gun Save Life case. So that case is moving forward, and they've actually got a oral arguments in the appellate court on that coming up in November. So we'll be watching that closely as well. But there was also a challenge to Cook County's gun and ammo tax. This has been 12 years in the making, Dan. Cook County in 2012, they passed an ordinance that's levied a $25 per gun tax and a 1 to 5 cent tax per round of ammunition, depending on the caliber. And in 2021, I believe it was, I'm checking my notes, the Illinois Supreme Court ultimately got that case and ruled against the county. Well, shortly thereafter, the county, they changed their ordinance and tried to implement it again. Well, Todd Vandermeide, a gun rights advocate in Illinois, he sued on Second Amendment grounds. The lower court and the circuit court dismissed the case. Vandermeide took it to the appellate court, but the states went ahead and requested that the Illinois Supreme Court take the case on appeal. And the Illinois Supreme Court this week denied that motion. So it's back to the district court in that challenge of the gun and ammo tax. But Dan, not the only action that happened in courts. Back to the federal courts, you've got the challenge against the prohibition on individuals carrying concealed firearms on mass transit. A federal district judge late last month ruled that that's a violation of the Second Amendment, and the state has filed a motion to appeal. But the federal judge in that district case is demanding that they have a telephone conference with the state attorneys, because apparently the state attorneys in one of their filings said that just days after the prohibition of concealed carry on mass transit was found unconstitutional, they claim that just days after that, there were 4 people shot on Chicago mass transit. So the judge in that case not seeming to be too happy about that, and demanded a telephone conference with the attorneys who wrote that sentence. I imagine they're probably going to get some verbal lashings from the judge there as that case proceeds. So that's a whole host of different things happening here in the state of Illinois on a whole range of different kinds of gun control laws.
And because these are all ongoing cases, no finality in any of them, there's going to be plenty of more to write about, Greg. I don't know how you keep up with all of these Second Amendment cases, because they're all over the state too. Some are up in the Chicago area, some are downstate. The trial you covered just last week was in East St. Louis.
Then you've also got federal courts versus state courts, right. And I will say I accept tips at gbishop@thecentersquare.com. A lot of different eyes are on this. So if people want to, feed me some tips, you can do that. Just email me, gbishop@thecentersquare.com.
And you're talking about information tips there, Greg, not monetary
information tips. Yes.
I just wanted to clarify that. Well, thanks for the extensive update, Greg, but why don't we move on? A relatively new law that hasn't gone into effect yet, but has been passed by the legislature, signed by Governor Pritzker, it's pitting retailers, merchants, against banks and credit card companies. There was a press conference that was held this week from the merchants, the retailers, who think the new law is effective or will be good. First, tell us about what this new law is, and then let's go into what was said this week.
Might get a little into the weeds here on tax policy, Dan, but I think it's important. So what ultimately passed as part of the budget package for the fiscal year 2025 budget that started July 1st is an Interchange Prohibition Act. And what that is, every time you go to a store and you buy groceries, for instance, and you're paying with your debit or your credit card, well, in order for that transaction to be facilitated, financial institutions, banks, credit card companies, they have portals and, physical devices where you swipe their card, tap their card, insert their card, and that has infrastructure that's needed. So these financial institutions charge the retailer a transaction fee. And there's a whole host of different fees all associated with that. So that's what the interchange fee is. But with the law that passed in Illinois set to take effect July 1st, 2025, and the governor signed it, it prohibits that interchange fee on sales taxes and on tips. So this all came out in the final days of spring session back in May, and it caught the financial institutions a little off guard. They said during a late night hearing that this could cause chaos in the financial transaction space, and it could require that consumers are burdened by having to swipe once for the goods and services, where they can charge an interchange fee, and then swipe again for taxes and tips, where they won't be charged an interchange fee. So the financial institutions pushing back on this. Fast forward to just a few weeks ago, Dan, the financial institutions joined together and filed a federal lawsuit in the Northern District of Illinois to try to block implementation of the law while they discuss the merits of the law. The law, by the way, first in the nation. No other state has done this, where they prohibit a interchange fee on taxes and tips. But the retailers, they support this. And really, it seems to have been kind of a this for that, because rewinding all the way back to February, when the governor introduced his proposed budget, he wanted to cap what's called the retailer's discount. And we've talked about this before, Dan. It would have generated millions of dollars, and the retailers were against the cap because they act as the middleman of sorts for state and local governments in collecting sales taxes. So when you go to the store, there's not a tax man standing right there saying, okay, we'll take our tax now. No, the retailers are the one that facilitate that. That takes time, that takes manpower, that takes infrastructure. So retailers would get a discount on what they owed the state based off of the sales taxes they collected and remitted back to the state and local governments. And by capping that, that would have meant that they would not have gotten nearly the discounts, especially for some of the much larger retailers that they get when they have to remit these taxes. So the retailers all throughout spring session opposed to that cap. But then last minute, you had this interchange prohibition come up. And the retailers then quieted down on their opposition to the retailer's discount cap. So the retailers now saying that they have public polling showing that the public supports ending the interchange fee for taxes and tips. But the bankers and the credit unions are firing back, saying that this violates federal law. Federal law supersedes any kind of law that Illinois wants to implement, and they're going to courts to prove their case. So I don't think it's going to be the last time we hear about this story either.
I would guess not. I'll tell you what, I wonder if the law does go into effect and they haven't figured out technology-wise how on a single swipe to not charge the interchange fee on the sales taxes and tips, but the technology can charge the interchange fee on the purchase of the product, the cost of the product. I wonder how that would affect tip workers, because are many consumers going to just get frustrated with having to swipe twice, as we say?
The retailers, they pushed back on that because I asked them that. I asked, are you concerned this is going to cause chaos and burden the consumer to have to possibly swipe twice? And the Illinois Retail Merchants Association president and CEO, Rob Carr, he said that's a scare tactic from the financial institutions. And he pointed to when you go to a restaurant with friends and you get the bill, you send the bill with your card and they swipe that. And then they bring you the receipt that says how much you want to tip. And he says right now, they don't take your card again to pay for the tip. It's already worked in. So he claims that there's already systems in place that can allow for this. And he also says that the opposition really is from the financial institutions that are making a lot of profit off of these interchange fees. But again, the lawsuit's been filed. Whether or not there are arguments that Illinois law is superseded by federal law, something we'll watch closely.
Greg, the election day is just about 6 weeks away, if you can believe that. But voters in Illinois, everywhere but Chicago and Cook County, that's coming. Today was the first day they could early vote. Of course, the marquee matchup is former President Donald Trump, who is the GOP nominee for president, and then sitting Vice President Kamala Harris, who is the Democratic nominee for president. That's the big race that we and national media are talking about all the time, but there are a host of other races on the election. Every single state house district is up. about a third of state Senate races are up, and there are other races that'll be on the ballot.
Don't forget about Congress. Every seat of the U.S. House is up in Illinois as well.
Exactly. So tell us just about how early voting works currently, and then it'll be expanded in the coming days and weeks.
Yeah, so early voting essentially gives voters the opportunity to cast their vote early, and they can go to their local county election office, and that's typically the county clerk that handles that, and they can cast their ballot. So they can walk in during business hours, announce their name, get a ballot, fill it out, and turn it in, and be done with it. Because, again, 39 days here before the November 5th general election, some people may want to just be done with it and wipe their hands and say, I'm out. I've got it in. I'm done. I don't have to pay attention to the national politics anymore, or even the state level politics until after November. But there's also the mail-in balloting, Dan. We'll be looking at that because one thing that's interesting is the state does tabulate just how many mail-in ballots have been sent. So people should be, if they did request a mail-in ballot, they should be receiving those ballots either today, Thursday, or throughout the weekend into next week, or shortly after they still request their mail-in ballot. So that's another opportunity. People could take those mail-in ballots, fill them out, and take them directly to the clerk's office or their election official's office, or they can mail them in. And some people are saying if you are going to do the mail-in provision, get it in as early as possible, because if you're using the mail, it could take, a week, if not more, to get it to the elections office. And sometimes, depending on where you're at, it could go to other states before it gets to your local election office. Others are encouraging people to just take that mail-in ballot right to the election office and turn it in. So that's another option that people have. But there's also soon to be early voting locations as we get closer to the election, where people will be able to go to not their traditional polling place, but a different polling place to cast their ballot early. So a variety of different options in Illinois leading up to the November 5th general election for people to cast their ballots early.
And, every election is important. Generally speaking, the presidential election has the highest voter turnout, but even then, it barely surpasses 50% of voters. So if you don't have a voting plan, if you don't know who you're going to vote for, I encourage everyone to, learn who's going to be on your ballot and make an effort to vote, whether it's, early voting at one of these early voting sites or on Election Day, November 5th. Greg, we have time for just one more story briefly. Let's talk about the Supreme Court decision that was handed down regarding police stops and the smell of cannabis. When a police stops a moving vehicle, he smells cannabis in the car. The Supreme Court ruled that is not a probable cause for a full search.
Yeah, cannabis odor no longer passing the smell test for searches during traffic stops. And this was an interesting case. A couple of different cases actually consolidated. They heard it in January, where the arguments were, listen, something that's in plain sight or a sound that can be recorded, that could be ample evidence for probable cause. But smell is subjective and should not be used, especially if the smell of cannabis, it's a legal product now. And a lot of interesting arguments, especially the state saying that if you're transporting it in a car, it's required to be in an odor-proof container. And if they smell cannabis, raw cannabis or burnt cannabis, that should be grounds for probable cause. But the Supreme Court justices weren't buying it, and they sided with those who had searches based off of the smell of cannabis, essentially saying that the odor of cannabis is no longer what can be used to justify a warrantless search during a traffic stop. How this is going to impact things moving forward for police, we shall see.
Greg, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with all of these stories and more at thecentersquare.com.